Hey, 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 how you doing? What happened to the intro music? How bizarre. I must press more buttons. Maybe I pressed the wrong button. Who knows? It's Wednesday evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Dave Coplin here with another session on dialing into the future of work. This week, brilliantly, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. We're going to be talking about the organizational culture, and in particular, how you build organizational culture in a world where you are dispersed. I've said this before on this show, and I will say it again. Never, ever search for office culture on stock art video websites, because this is what you get. My God, if I was ever in this kind of meeting, look how good it also gets. Here's another one that you'll love, and I hope many of you will relate to this. So the teams all are there. They're all having a great time. Who's this guy in the background? Look at his face now as they start to high five. This guy here, he is, I've gone too far. He is me. I have been in your meetings. I have been there with you when we were looking. Look at his face as we get this is what you're missing when you go in the office. This guy looking at you. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about something different. We're actually going to talk about something very close to my heart. We're going to talk about the concept of elephant powder. I'm going to introduce you in a second to the gentleman that first introduced me to the concept of elephant powder. I'm not going to tell you the joke because it would spoil the surprise, but elephant powder was kind of pre-pandemic. It was all of the stuff that we were doing in our organizations that was completely redundant and irrelevant. Now, I would argue that as you've gone through the pandemic, you've found quite a lot of elephant powder because it's the stuff that you said could never be done. It's the stuff you said could never be changed. My classic example, how many of you, now be honest, have sat there pre-pandemic and said, well, we couldn't possibly hire someone without having seen them first? How many of you actually done that in the last 6 months? What, all of you? Exactly. So on that note, let me bring you into today's guest. I'm going to bring you the fabulous David D'Souza. Now, not only is David D'Souza fabulous, he actually I listened to it again, he got a double fabulous on today's trailer. That's how good this guy is. He is by day, he is the director of membership for the CIPD, Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And by day and by night, he is one of the funniest, most thoughtful, most pragmatic, practical people I know who for years have been articulating about this way that we get to the nirvana, that I can sit on stage and I can paint a picture of what the future of work might be. This is the guy that has the opportunity to make it real, to engage with people, to bring it. So David, thank you so much for joining us. I've been so excited to get you on. How are you doing?
I'm slightly intimidated by the intro. I love talking to you. I'm really excited about this. I'd love to say it's great to be here with you today. Obviously, we're not physically together, but it's just nice to imagine you on my sofa. The warm glow.
I have to say, you look to be the comfiest guest that we've ever had on the show.
Most relaxed, I hope. I'm really looking forward to it.
So look, let's pick up on elephant powder, and so this is the point about David. Is David took a joke, but skewered it right into the heart of an issue that most organizations were feeling in a way that brings it to life. And the punchline of the joke is that you look for elephant powder in your organization. And he turned what is essentially a reasonable joke into a corporate mission. It's the sort of thing that certainly people in his audiences, and when I've used the story to tell some of my audiences, people are walking out, emailing me months later, say, hey, Dave, we found some more elephant powder. It's such brilliant. And so what I love about the concept is, and again, pre-pandemic, it was great because you were waking up people to the opportunity of transformation. I'm interested, David, just as an opener, my sense is the world of elephant powder has gone away and it's been replaced by, I don't know, Corona dust or Corona grease. I see lots of people who've had to change their policies. Do you think that's a thing? Do you think people are going to stick with that? They think is there more for us to do that the pandemic is going to help us to rip out of our organizations in order to be able to change?
Yeah, I think most organisations that I speak to have gone through that first set of changes quite well. And that was quite often a transition from definitely being physically based to working remotely. But what they did is they took the way that they were working prior and they found a way of doing that through technology. What they haven't done is harness technology effectively. What they haven't done, to your point, is cleared out all of the things that are a drag on the organisation or don't work within that context. But it has caused organisations, I think, quite often to focus on what really matters to them. And that's a healthy thing, and that's been driven by the market to some extent. But what's really important now is to focus on actually how you enable people.
Yeah, I certainly what I've seen, and I completely agree with that. Do you think though that there are still some organisations who are kind of just like hanging on, like just a few more months? It's just going to be 6 more months, and then we can put it all back and go back. Do you think that still exists, or are people now more of the mindset that actually, do you know what, we probably should have got rid of that process years ago anyway? What are you seeing?
I think there are still organisations, still leaders who have a kind of organisational comfort blanket that is the way things have always been. And they want to get that comfort blanket back. But the question has to be not how do we go back to what we were before? When can we go back? It's what are we going to do when we're going forward? Because that's one, a more interesting question, but two, opens up a raft of possibilities that you don't have if you're just thinking, well, when will this go back to what it was before?
No, the thing that I think is interesting is how it starts to unpick so many of the other facets that maybe we didn't think about. In the rush to get everybody online and get everybody with a Zoom or a Teams account and a laptop and all that sort of stuff. It's only now that we're really starting to come to terms with some of the changes. And I guess if I flip to one of the other stories that sort of caught my eye that I thought would be interesting to get your view on, and if I just flip over to it, is this is a piece from Forbes. When was it? About a week ago. Talking about this really interesting dynamic, and it's mostly happening in the US, but you can see potential for it to happen in the UK, where sort of employers are saying, well, hang on a minute, we pay you extra because you live in a really expensive part of the country. It might be Silicon Valley or wherever, and actually what you've decided to do during lockdown is to move to a much cheaper area, and as a result I'd quite like to renegotiate your salary. And you can see it in the UK with the London waiting and people no longer wanting to be in London. But slowly people are starting to unpick the contract that they share with their employer. And I guess what's your sense on this, David? Is this something that employers should be, really leaning into now, to start to think, a very holistic approach to what does the post-pandemic contract now look like, and do we need to adjust it, or is something this is something really that becomes more personal and is a more sort of needs must basis for individuals?
I think it's interesting. So it's happening in the US, an almost rate card system. If you'd like to move here, then we'll dock your pay by this amount. In the UK, our contract law is very different. I'd say in a far stronger way in favour of the employer, and that's employee, and that's probably right. But I know of organisations already starting to look at things like London waiting and say, well, we paid you a premium to be here, but you don't need to be here. It's an age-old thing that we don't necessarily pay for product or output. We, to some extent, factor in what the market says locally. But if you've got someone working in Birmingham and you've got someone working in London, someone working in Newcastle, you're expecting them all to output the same. It's a strange quirk, actually, of economics that we pay people in a different way, dependent on where they're located, rather than depending on what they provide for the organisation. So I think it will be an area for people to look at. But unlike the US, you won't have companies just unilaterally doing it. It's going to have to be a strange negotiated change. And that depends, to your point, around to what extent we take this as an opportunity to level up, think about distribution of wealth within the country, and actually where we distribute our organisations as well.
And do you think it's naive to think that as employees that we'll be open-minded about that? I mean, I remember when and all right, I mean, I made a bunch of personal choices about where I live, and at a time where I was commuting into London, and my season ticket used to be £6,000 a year. It was ridiculous. So I wouldn't. Would I mind if I suddenly started making less, but I didn't have to buy that ticket anymore? Maybe not. I'm in probably a different position to lots of people. But do you think employees would be open-minded about that? I guess, is that a conversation that employers could think would be constructive, or is it always going to be hard to lower someone's salary?
I think it's always going to be hard to lower someone's salary. I mean, it's part of human nature. It's what you agreed. And even if your house is worth less at the end of this, your mortgage payments or your rent are likely to be very similar to how they were before. And that's what you accepted the job on the principle on. And that's why organisations shouldn't be doing anything unilaterally. They need to think about long term, where they might be able to hire, where they might be able to get talent. But they've also got commitments to the people they already employ. And those commitments were correct and right for the time.
Do you think it will open up a truly global jobs market? Do you think employers will say, well, hang on a minute, these kind of skills, I can get them from anywhere in the world, right? And why don't I get them from a cheaper labour market, cheaper even than the UK?
There's definitely a possibility of that. It's a really interesting one. If you went back 5, 10 years and you were doing conference speaking like you or I, you would have talked about, a borderless world where technology enabled people to be hired from anywhere. And then what happened is you had a more protectionist kind of political position in the US and here. So we had Brexit, and it looked like we were going the other way. And now you've got this opening up due to technology again. So I think some organizations will certainly look at that from a point of view of cost, but actually cutting cost over time isn't the way to get excellence in organizations. So you still need to think about the team dynamics and the culture. And that's going to be the challenge for organizations going forward, not just where's cheapest, but where's best for what we need to deliver.
And it's so funny that you should mention culture. Because that's today's exam question. And it's been interesting. I sort of mentioned to you before we went on air that, you know, every week I put out a little trailer about what the show's broadly going to be about. Obviously, we've not had the conversation, so I don't know exactly what it's going to be about. But I mentioned that I really wanted to talk to you about culture because I know, you know, over the years, you've got a really good sort of feel for what culture is and how it's managed in an authentic and genuine way. And yet one of the most consistent questions I have been asked, or is the topic of conversation with all of my clients and all of the CEOs and whoever that I might be talking to, the employees, my mates, all that sort of stuff. The one thing that comes back, as well as trust, and I guess it's kind of bundled in, is how do you build, you know, the culture of an organization when you're never there, when you're never all together, and similarly when you've got people who are new to the organization, how do they ingest that culture? How do they know what it feels like, and how do they become part of that? So talk to me a bit about that at a high level, and then maybe we can dive in a couple of details. What do you see happening in organizations who are doing that well in terms of manifesting their culture well in a world where they're remote?
So the good news is there's kind of a cheat sheet, which is you can look at organizations that have been based remotely primarily for a long time. So organizations like Basecamp are a good example, and they actually open source lots of their material. So you can pop on, you can see Basecamp's induction plan. And what that does brilliantly is by the time you've read it, you pretty much know what it is to work there. You couldn't mistake it for another organization once you've read it. And what we need to be is far more overt when we're bringing people in, because the signals that you normally get, the chats that you might normally have casually with someone after a meeting or go for a quick coffee, they're harder to come by. And I do think there's something different about this video medium as well. It feels like everything's being documented. It feels more formal. That may change over time for many people, but if it's the first time you've worked this way, there's certainly challenges in doing it. And culture is about the basic assumptions that you have of the environment that you're working in. It's very difficult to form those when you're sitting in your own lounge or living room or kitchen.
No, exactly. I mean, I love what you're saying there about being purposeful in it. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, we've talked about before on this show, and certainly I've written about, is the people who sort of seem to get this world right are the ones that find a way of incorporating all of those sort of loose connections that we have in the office. And it's people who are thinking about, how do I replace the you know, the water cooler chat, or the when I'm walking down the corridor through someone else's team and I see my mate and we have a chat, you know, and I wouldn't normally do that because actually I'm locked away in my room. And they find a way of incorporating those into the natural sort of progression. And these are the people who I think, you know, I've seen examples of people who, you know, who basically say the first 10 minutes of any meeting is social chit chat. You know, how's a kid? So what we do on the weekend? And you know, looking at virtual teams who've been working virtually for years, that's been a hallmark. And then there are others who are starting to invent sort of social hours where they sort of just open up a video channel and bring people in. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of bringing those in to and being purposeful about it rather than just hoping it's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a really interesting combination. I think there are two things going on. So to go back to that elephant powder, remove all of the stuff that unnecessarily takes time from organizations and invest that into socialization. So you can give that back to people in terms of their family and their time there, but you can also give it back to people in terms of, right, this time's okay to just connect in. You know, you could have a choir in the workplace. I know people have done quizzes, but you need a combination of, I guess, that top tier socialization, the actual work. You probably need to be a bit more clinical with that and how you do it in the different work types. When are we creating? When are we delivering? But the middle tier is really interesting. That's what time do we have together so I can show you that I care, and we can properly connect as human beings best as we can through this medium.
Yeah, it's funny because I mean it's got to be so hard, hasn't it? And especially, I mean, this is why the sort of middle managers struggle. It's like let's set up a David. I'd like to set up a 30-minute video call with you so we could be authentic and engage genuinely. You know, it's like I just feel like seriously, dude, there's no way.
No, it's,
But
we've done some research. A third of line managers haven't spoken to their teams about their welfare since this started. Right, so that's just people failing to connect on a human level whatsoever. That's just transacting. That's not a sustainable way of working. That won't get you trust. That's no kind of culture that you want to have. But as you say, it's a challenge, right? It's a
yeah,
challenge opening up and connecting. There's
do you,
risk to it.
I mean, I know you guys have done some really great work about sort of mental health and mental well-being in the workplace. Do you think this will be seen? You know, if we look back in time, will this be the moment that sort of mental health and well-being really took the main stage in terms of helping companies do their best work? Is this the moment?
Yeah, I think it's central in the narrative. People understand there's a psychological impact of what's happening. And also, you can't separate anymore. That notion, that old fashioned notion, don't bring your home life into work. Well, one, we're in our homes. And
Yeah,
secondly, we're all going through a pandemic, and it would be a pretty big elephant in the room to ignore if
yeah,
we just kind of went, how was your weekend? Because
yeah,
we kind
yeah.
of know the boundaries to it. So yeah, it's absolutely a time for organisations to put that centrally and to stop that. Are you for the organisation? You for the employee? Well, look, we need our people to be supported well, to be enabled and to feel trust, and to work well as a team for the organisation to succeed.
Do you think that can be done? We early on, there's a lovely guy called Richard Tyler who's been on the show, and I'm hope we'll have him again. Does a lot of work in this sort of mental health and well-being. We ended up having a laugh actually about the concept of corporate compassion, and we were talking about for all of the organisations that we'd work with who would take the concept of corporate compassion and turn it into a 30-minute readiness video that basically we had to all make sure that we'd watched, and then we say yes, we've got a compassionate culture. Do you know what I mean? And so how do organizations do this with a level of genuine authenticity in a way that even cynical gits like me and you would be able to think, well, actually, do you know, they're really trying there. No, no, I really get that.
I think first of all, it's probably not a resilience program. That could be part of it, but sometimes that's just pushing responsibility. You have to cope with this, and if you don't, you haven't studied hard enough. I think the key to it is actually it's the individual relationships as much as the corporate one.
Yeah,
So corporates can do things that show they care, whether that's giving people time off, whether that's being really considerate with their policies, whether that's being more family friendly, whether that's being caring with people who have caring responsibilities. But the main relationship that most people have is still with their line manager. And they have to play a key role in showing people that they care, that they're accessible, and that they can be trustworthy. Because actually, the reason organizational initiatives often feel hollow is because you go, yeah, but that's not how it is day to day.
yeah.
That's not my actual existence. And that comes through a whole host of different factors.
Yeah, no, I really like that, and it's funny because we've sort of skirted around this in the past in our conversation, but it, and these are probably the wrong words, but it's this difference between management and leadership, and I wonder if the place that we need to get organisations now is thinking really differently about leadership in their organization and how they convert managers. And again, people have talked about sort of management being this industrial age sort of technique, and actually leadership is something that's a bit more fit for purpose for the digital age. Is that something that you and your members are sort of seeing, that this really, and I'm not really talking about the top of the organization, I'm really probably talking more squarely in the middle of the organization, becomes the key sort of gateway to success, getting those people equipped with the right skills?
Yeah, I think if you had a bad manager going into this, you've probably got a horrific manager
Yeah,
now. If you've got a good manager who cared, they're still exploring different ways of supporting this from you, but also to make you the best you can be. And I think part of the challenge that we have at this moment actually is how difficult it is for people to raise a voice if they feel at risk of their job being lost, or they feel actually it's hard to connect with people through this technology. So there's a role for, if you like, hierarchically, the people at the top to make themselves more accessible all the way through. But then it's about those one-on-one conversations. But yeah, a bad manager now, if that's the entirety of your world and focus, it's a bad place to be.
No, exactly. But so you talked about top down and sort of the middle, but equally, do we think now that there's a different opportunity for the employees, the individuals themselves, to want to be part of that conversation? Because and maybe this is a step too far, but one of the things that I found really interesting and heartening as a result of the lockdown is how we've all become a bit more humble and a bit more human about how we engage with other people. There's less of the, do you know who I am, or you're serving me a meal, how dare you be late, or whatever. Do you think there's an opportunity to carry that forward into the culture of the organization?
Yeah, because people are remarkable, right? So there's a role for hierarchy, I think, but if you think of hierarchy as support rather than domination, you get a very different mental model of it. And most of us, we can remember our best bosses, and you wouldn't not want to have had them. But people are remarkable. If you can get more people in an organization thinking, more people in an organization voicing, more people in an organization creating, that's an absolute win for everyone. So we've got technology that can enable that aggregation of ideas in a far more rapid way than we've ever had before. Now's a really good time to listen. And the best leaders will be open to doing that and parking themselves a bit to the one side and seeing what they can bring out of other people, because that's the trick, and it's a hell of a lot easier than trying to do it all yourself.
No, exactly. So one of the sort of bits of feedback I had today on the trailer was an old colleague of mine who's changed roles during lockdown, and basically saying how how weird it is to try and figure out the culture of the new organization when you're remote, and it forced me to reflect a little bit, and it sort of here's my sort of proposal, and it's probably really naive, but I'd be interested in your view on it. My sense is actually we kid ourselves about how quickly we understand and become part of an organization's culture. We in our minds we feel like it happens very quickly, but if I reflect on my experiences, I think it took me several years to truly be an integral part of an organization's culture, for them to understand me and for me to truly understand them. And so based on that theory, my theory was, does the fact that I'm never going to be in there actually make a a significant difference? It might be a bit longer, but actually it's still years. How naive is that, would you say?
I think it's a really nice idea that actually it takes longer than you think, and I think that's probably true. What you're normally doing when you join an organisation is you're taking your cues and your data and your information from people, and you assume that's how it is. So the first person that you meet goes, this person's like that, and then it can take years to realise that half of what you were told when you first started was just that person's view of the world. I think what is harder is communicating like this, because it doesn't have that hint of human connection, which even with the best technology, you still need and want. And I think a good example that I'd use is that organizations for a while have been putting together nice branding videos where everyone smiles. I think you had kind of a similar one around culture at the
Yeah.
start. And this is what it's like working here. But we all know that's never quite what it's like working here. And I think you get more sanitized versions of organizations through video, where people tended to learn, right or wrongly, was quite often when they went for drinks in the pub on the first Friday night and found out what people were really like when they were relaxed.
Yeah.
And, we're a bit on stage most of the time at the moment.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's almost like you can try too hard to solve the problem. I reckon, and maybe some of it is about letting the culture speak for itself, and do that. So let's,
But your point around time is absolutely the right one. You can panic about people not getting up to speed long enough. We can just go, well, they will get there with time, so we just need to leave it a little bit longer.
Yeah, I wonder if it's almost like letting the results speak for themselves, and so my I guess my personal view, based on what you said, is I wonder if it's energy that's better spent getting the leaders of the organization and the managers of the organization in the right place than trying to figure out, well, how do we articulate what it's like to be us, to people who are just joining. And maybe we kid ourselves that and maybe we've always kidded ourselves that organizational culture is something that we have direct control over. I mean, what does that look like? Do you think that's fair, or have I gone too far?
No, no, a culture is far more organic than we like to think. So, can you influence it? Can you shift it over time? Potentially. Come back to that idea of basic assumptions. You can change people's basic assumptions about you and the organization, but it's really complex. And the amount of culture change programs that fail because they don't understand how resilient a culture is phenomenal. So it's a complex thing. It can be defined, it can be examined, it can be shifted, but it takes craft and a lot of effort. And it's really resilient in itself. It corrects, it fights to stay the same. So that's why so many CEOs come in with bold ideas and just kind of bounce off the edge of organizations.
Yeah.
Because it really does take something to shift.
Well, it always results in that great. Clearly, we need to articulate the mission. That's what we need to do. We'll articulate the mission, then we'll articulate the mission, and then we'll print it in 6 feet high vinyl letters outside the corporate reception. That'll do it.
Well, it's posters. So it's when you can't sit down to go to the toilet without seeing the values on the back of the toilet door. Posters are the worst manifestation of corporate kind of like, we will get you even in your most private moments. You need to remember these 5 things. That tells you that they can't find a different way of doing it.
It reminds me of, I was working for a large grocery organisation in the UK who was quite proud of the fact that none of the eggs they sold were from battery farms. And they would put these little signs on all of the desks and all of the tables in the canteen. And I was working with the IT guys, and there's literally these signs everywhere. And then you sort of look around you, and there is like thousands of contractors all crammed into these tiny desks, just working away.
Yeah. The hens are okay. The hens are okay.
Exactly. It's just like, okay, I know where your values are, so that's good. It's tough. I know it's tough. You talked a while ago on a podcast that I listened to, and one of the things that you love to say, and we're sort of wrapping this up now, I guess, and trying to give people a sense of direction about what they can do with this. And you talked about the importance of experiments rather than prediction, which made me smile, because as I often get described as a fortune teller, which I think is brilliant. And of course, I am a fortune teller, so predictions are what I do. But I do love this concept of experiments. Could you talk me through a bit more about sort of where you were going with that and what you were after?
Yeah, and it comes down to, so you and I quite often would have been asked, what will work look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time.
Yeah.
But actually, at the moment, everything's gone up in the air, and we don't know really how it's going to come down. But we've got some agency over what that might look like. And it's up to us to make those choices. But we need to be humble enough to understand the landscape is constantly shifting and changing. And we're probably getting some things wrong now. So the best thing we can do is be humble enough to experiment. And that's not saying we know what's happening, so we know what we need to do. It's as leaders, as people within organizations, to step back and just go, look, it's very simple. We don't know what's happening, so we're going to try this. We don't think that's quite working, so we're going to try this. We're going to experiment here. Small scale, not necessarily high risk. We'll try this for a week. We'll try it for a few weeks. But instead of thinking that we need a kind of grand operating model that we've all agreed on, just accept and be humble enough to understand that it's really hard at the moment. No one's got the answers. So step back and just, keep experimenting, keep with small scale pilots. And then chances are you'll stumble across some things that work and you want to keep doing.
I love that, David. And I love what's implicit in that is the transparency of it. And it reminds me, we were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with the education guys, so thinking about how we transform education in digital. And one of the best suggestions that came from the guys that we were talking to was, he sort of said, look, the teachers in their classroom have got 30, bright, interested, engaged individuals who will have an opinion on what this is like. And to me, there's no different to the team that you're in, the organization that you're in. You're surrounded by people who have a bloody opinion on what this is like. And so, if you're open and you sort of involve them and invite them to be involved, that has to be a win. That has to be the right way forward for people.
Completely. None of us have done this before, and I've just had a conversation with my team and just said, look, I haven't done this before. Right? I haven't had to work this way. I certainly haven't had to work against this backdrop before. So I don't have the answers. So if you can help me puzzle them through, if you've got better ideas than me, that has to be a starting point. But we need to try and be better. And I think you and I have spoken before. It's not just better for organizations, it's better societally. Work wasn't working for millions of people. How can we actually come out of this with something that, whilst it would never justify the pain we've gone through, is at least a good outcome on the far side of it? That has to be something we aspire to. Because going back to where we were, no one wants that.
No, absolutely. Well, this is why I think I've always loved, you and the organisation and the work that you do, because it is about, you know, I don't know if it's a 21st century thing, but, you know, work used to be really terrible for lots of people. And we've come to a place where it's still terrible for lots of people, but equally there are lots of people who actually quite like work. And you know, if you're lucky enough to get a job that you love with an organisation that treats you well, it's a pretty special thing. And if we could just make that happen at scale, wouldn't we be able to make life better? The bit for me, and I mean, and you've echoed it, and again, God, the number of times we sort of said this on this show, is I'm just really scared that we're going to end up going back. You know, we've spent 6 months walking over hot coals and broken glass, and we've learnt a lot of the lessons, and we know where it works, and we know where it doesn't work. We've got another sort of period of ambiguity in front of us, and yet people are still thinking, you know, I just want to be back in the office, I just want the kids to be back at school every day. And you know, we've come too far as a society. I think we've sacrificed too much to let any of this go. To walk away without the learning from it would be an even bigger tragedy than we're already in. And so I think it's go on.
Yeah, it's a maturing. It's a maturing of the way we think about work. It's a maturing of the way we think about society and workplace in it. And you know, I talked about comfort blankets earlier. When you grow up to be an adult, you don't go back to the comfort blanket. It might have made you feel good, but you understand that your world is bigger than that. And we need to get away from that and start heading forward. So absolutely agree with you. Couldn't agree more.
No, that's brilliant. Well, listen, David, on that note, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking your time, your Wednesday evening in the world's comfiest settee, a Chesterfield, I think you referred to it as, which was an education for me.
Chesterfield.
So look, thanks for joining us, and that was brilliant. So what a fantastic guy. We're so lucky that he could spend some time with us and talk to us about what's going on. I hope everything is good with you. You know that we would love to have your subscription. We would love to have you working with us, talking to us. That would be fantastic. You can subscribe on the link below. Hit the like button if you've enjoyed it. We'll be back again next week. All right, thanks for tuning in.
There are 1,000 stories in the Envisioners' future. This is just one of them.